I'm standing outside the family mansion I built with my own hands, holding eviction papers in the pouring rain while my sister Madison throws my belongings out the second-story window. My parents watch from the covered porch, arms crossed as my college diploma lands in a puddle at my feet. 3 years ago, they promised me this house would be my inheritance for putting them through their medical emergencies and paying off their debts. Now they're giving everything to Madison, who just got out of rehab for the third time, because she needs it more. The rain keeps coming down harder as I stare at my engineering degree floating in that muddy water. 28 years of memories flood back, each one a reminder of how this moment was inevitable. Growing up in Toledo, Ohio, Madison was always the golden child, despite her constant chaos, while I was the reliable son who never seemed to matter. When we were kids, Madison could do no wrong in our parents' eyes. I remember being 8 years old, spending 3 weeks building a volcano for the science fair. I'd saved my allowance for months to buy the special paints and modeling clay. The night before the competition, Madison decided she wanted to see what would happen if she poured orange juice into my carefully crafted crater. The whole project dissolved into a soggy mess of papier-mâché and dreams. Instead of punishing Madison Dad, Harold sat me down and explained how I should have been more careful about leaving my project where my 5-year-old sister could reach it. Mom Linda nodded along, suggesting I should apologize to Madison for making her feel bad about the accident. I learned that day that taking responsibility meant taking blame for everything that went wrong around Madison. Throughout high school, the pattern only got worse. While I worked 2 jobs at the local grocery store and pizza place to save money for college, Madison received a brand new red Mustang for her 16th birthday. She crashed it 3 weeks later, driving home drunk from a party. Instead of consequences, she got a lecture about being more careful and a replacement car by the end of the month. I earned a full academic scholarship to Ohio State for engineering, something that took years of perfect grades and countless extracurricular activities. The day the acceptance letter arrived, Mom glanced at it briefly and said it was nice before returning to a phone conversation about Madison's latest drama with her high school boyfriend. Dad was too busy researching lawyers for Madison's upcoming court date to acknowledge my achievement at all. College graduation should have been one of the proudest moments of my life. 4 years of studying, graduating summa cum laude, landing job offers from 3 major firms. But Mom and Dad never made it to the ceremony. They were sitting in a courthouse in Cleveland, instead holding Madison's hand during her second DUI hearing. I walked across that stage alone, accepting my diploma, while other families cheered in the audience. The phone call that changed everything came on a Tuesday evening last month. I was reviewing blueprints for a commercial project when my cell rang. The voice on the other end identified herself as Janet Morrison from First National Bank, calling about missed payments on the mortgage for 347 Maple Street. My stomach dropped. That was my address, the house I'd been living in and maintaining for 3 years. Janet explained that there had been a second mortgage taken out on the property 18 months ago, something I knew nothing about. The original mortgage I'd been paying faithfully was current, but this additional loan for $85,000 hadn't seen a payment in 4 months. Since my name was still on the original deed from when I'd helped my parents purchase the property, the bank considered me responsible for both loans. I drove straight to Mom and Dad's apartment that night, demanding answers. They sat on their worn sofa, looking everywhere except at my face. Dad finally admitted they'd needed money quickly for Madison's latest rehab attempt, the luxury facility in Arizona that cost more than most people's annual salary. The house had been their only asset, with enough equity to secure that kind of loan. When I asked why they hadn't discussed it with me first, Mom's voice turned defensive. I was successful. I had a good job. I didn't need their help the way Madison did. They figured I could handle the extra payments if necessary. After all, I'd been managing everything else for years. Standing there in their cramped living room, surrounded by the secondhand furniture I'd helped them buy after their medical bills destroyed their credit, I realized the truth. They'd never seen the house as mine, despite 3 years of mortgage payments, property taxes, and maintenance costs. In their minds, I was just the responsible son who would handle whatever financial burden they created. Madison was the one who needed protecting, needed support, needed their resources. The eviction papers in my hand bring me back to the present moment. Through the rain, I can see Madison laughing as she tosses another box of my belongings from the bedroom window. My laptop bag hits the driveway with a sickening crack. Inside that bag are 5 years' worth of work files, client presentations, and project designs that represent hundreds of hours of effort. Dad steps forward from the porch, his voice cutting through the storm. He wants me to understand that this isn't personal. Madison has completed rehab successfully. This time she's ready for responsibility, and the house represents a fresh start for her recovery. I've already established myself in life. I have options. I can find another place to live. What he doesn't say, but what hangs in the air between us, is that I'm the strong one who doesn't need help. I'm the son who will figure things out on his own, while they focus their energy on saving Madison from herself once again. The pattern that started with that ruined science fair project has reached its logical conclusion. I'm standing in the rain holding legal documents that strip away everything I've worked for while my parents watch approvingly as my sister destroys the remnants of my life. The water soaking through my shoes is cold, but not as cold as the realization that this moment has been building for 20 years. Every time I've sacrificed for this family, every dollar I've spent keeping them afloat, every opportunity I've passed up to take care of their problems, has led to this rainy evening where I'm being cast aside for the daughter who's never contributed anything but chaos. But as I watch another box of my possessions tumble into the mud, something shifts inside me. For the first time in my adult life, I'm not thinking about how to fix this situation or how to make peace with my family's decision. I'm thinking about how spectacularly wrong they are about Madison's recovery and how much they're about to regret choosing her over me. Walking away from that house in the rain, I can't stop thinking about how we got to this point. 5 years ago, my life was completely different. I had plans, dreams, a future that didn't revolve around cleaning up my family's messes. Then everything fell apart in the span of 6 weeks, and I made choices that led directly to this moment of betrayal. It started with Dad's heart attack on a cold February morning. Mom called me at 7:30 while I was getting ready for work, her voice shaking with panic. Harold had collapsed in their kitchen, clutching his chest and struggling to breathe. The paramedics were already there, but she needed me to meet them at Toledo Hospital immediately. I drove through morning traffic with my hazard lights flashing, my mind racing through worst-case scenarios. Dad was only 58, but he'd been a heavy smoker for 30 years and carried an extra 40 pounds around his midsection. The cardiologist's diagnosis was worse than I'd feared. Massive blockage in 3 major arteries damaged to his heart muscle and a recovery process that would take months of expensive cardiac rehabilitation. Before I could fully process Dad's condition, Mom delivered the second blow. During the stress of Harold's hospitalization, her doctor had called with results from a routine mammography. Linda had early-stage breast cancer caught, thankfully, before it spread, but requiring immediate surgery followed by aggressive chemotherapy and radiation treatments. Within 2 weeks, my parents went from financially stable retirees to patients facing hundreds of thousands of dollars in medical bills. Dad's insurance covered basic care, but the cardiac specialist's experimental treatments and extended rehabilitation weren't included in his plan. Mom's cancer required a specific oncologist who didn't accept their insurance at all. I sat in that hospital waiting room watching other families deal with similar crises and made a decision that would reshape the next 5 years of my life. My parents had raised me, sacrificed for my education, and deserved every chance at survival and recovery. I would handle whatever financial burden was necessary to get them the best possible care. My engagement to Sarah had been the one bright spot in my life at that time. We'd been together since college, and she'd accepted my proposal 6 months before Dad's heart attack. Sarah worked as a pediatric nurse, understanding and compassionate, someone who shared my values about family loyalty and commitment. When I explained the situation to her, she immediately offered to postpone our wedding and honeymoon to help with medical expenses. But Sarah's parents felt differently about my family obligations. During a tense dinner at their suburban Cleveland home, her father, Marcus, made his position crystal clear. Marriage meant putting your spouse first, not sacrificing your future, for parents who should have planned better for retirement and medical emergencies. If I chose to drain my savings and earning potential on my parents' problems, I would be demonstrating that Sarah wasn't my priority. The ultimatum came on a rainy Thursday evening in their perfectly maintained living room. Sarah sat between her parents' tears streaming down her face as they presented their terms. Either I limited my financial support to a reasonable amount and proceeded with our wedding plans, or Sarah would need to reconsider whether I was ready for the responsibilities of marriage and family. I looked at Sarah, hoping she would speak up, defend our relationship, tell her parents they were wrong to demand such a choice. Instead, she quietly removed her engagement ring and placed it on the coffee table between us. Her voice was barely a whisper, as she explained that she loved me but couldn't compete with my family's endless needs for attention and resources. That night, I drove back to Toledo with the ring in my pocket and a future that had suddenly become much lonelier. Over the next 4 years, I threw myself completely into taking care of my parents' recovery and financial stability. Every paycheck, every bonus, every freelance project went toward medical bills, insurance gaps, and household expenses they could no longer manage. I moved back into my childhood bedroom to save on rent, converting the basement into a home office where I could work late into the night on additional consulting projects. Weekends meant driving Dad to cardiac rehabilitation appointments and sitting with Mom during her chemotherapy sessions. Evenings were spent reviewing insurance claims, negotiating payment plans with hospitals, and researching treatment options that might be covered under different programs. The financial bleeding never seemed to stop. Dad's heart required 2 additional procedures and a pacemaker installation that cost $37,000 beyond what insurance would cover. Mom's chemotherapy triggered severe reactions that required emergency hospitalizations and expensive supportive medications. Physical therapy, occupational therapy, nutritional counseling, psychological support for dealing with their medical trauma, it all added up to numbers that made my head spin. During this entire period, Madison was living in San Diego, supposedly discovering herself through various artistic pursuits and spiritual explorations. Her phone calls home were sporadic, but always followed the same pattern. She was struggling with her mental health, dealing with the trauma of our parents' illnesses, and needed space to process everything that was happening to our family. Mom and Dad spoke about Madison's absence with understanding and compassion. She was sensitive, they explained, too emotionally fragile to handle the stress of serious illness and medical procedures. It was better for everyone if she focused on her own healing and personal growth, rather than forcing herself to be involved in situations that might trigger her anxiety and depression. Meanwhile, I was working 80-hour weeks between my regular engineering job and freelance consulting projects, trying to generate enough income to keep everyone's head above water. My social life disappeared entirely. Friends stopped inviting me to events because I always had a family obligation or work deadline that took priority. Dating was impossible when every spare dollar went toward medical bills and every free moment was spent managing my parents' care. The house purchase came about during Dad's second year of recovery. Their apartment lease was up for renewal, and the rent increase was more than they could afford on Dad's disability payments and Mom's reduced Social Security benefits. I found the 3-bedroom ranch on Maple Street in a quiet neighborhood where they could live comfortably and I could build equity instead of throwing money away on rent. Getting approved for the mortgage required using my income and credit rating since my parents' financial situation had been destroyed by medical debt. The down payment came from my savings account along with closing costs and immediate repairs the house needed before move-in. Dad insisted on putting my name on the deed since I was financing everything, a decision that seemed like simple practicality at the time. For 3 years, I maintained that house like it was my own because everyone told me it essentially was. I paid property taxes, homeowners insurance, utility bills, and maintenance costs. When the furnace died during a February cold snap, I arranged for emergency replacement. When the roof developed leaks during spring storms, I coordinated repairs and absorbed the $4,000 cost without hesitation. My parents' gratitude during those years felt genuine and heartfelt. Dad would often comment on how lucky they were to have a son who cared enough to sacrifice his own opportunities for their well-being. Mom frequently told neighbors and friends about my dedication to family, describing me as the kind of son every parent hoped to raise. But even during those positive moments, there were constant reminders about Madison's special circumstances and ongoing struggles. Every time she called home upset about a failed relationship or lost job, Mom would spend hours consoling her and arranging for emergency funds to be transferred to her account. When Madison decided she needed therapy to deal with childhood issues, Dad immediately researched therapists in San Diego and offered to pay for sessions. I never complained about the differential treatment because I understood their reasoning. Madison was struggling with addiction issues, mental health problems, and an inability to maintain stable employment or relationships. I was successful, financially secure, and emotionally stable enough to handle additional responsibilities. It made logical sense for them to focus their worry and support on the child who needed it most. What I didn't realize was how completely my own needs and wants had disappeared from their consideration. Years of being the reliable son, the problem solver, the financial safety net had transformed me into something less than a person in their eyes. I had become a resource, a tool they used to manage their problems while directing their actual parental concern toward Madison's endless series of crises. The first hint of what was coming occurred 6 months ago during a casual conversation about estate planning. Mom mentioned they were updating their wills to make sure Madison would be taken care of if anything happened to them. When I asked about the specifics, Dad explained they were considering giving the house to Madison since I was already established and wouldn't need their help. I remember feeling confused rather than angry at first. Madison hadn't contributed a single dollar toward the house purchase or maintenance. She'd never lived there, never helped with my parents' care, never even visited during their worst medical crises. How could giving her the house be considered fair or logical? Dad's explanation made a twisted kind of sense according to their value system. I was strong and capable, someone who would succeed regardless of circumstances. Madison was fragile and vulnerable, someone who needed the security of property ownership to maintain her sobriety and mental health stability. Since I'd been managing fine without inheriting anything, they wanted to focus their legacy on helping the child who truly needed support. That conversation should have been my warning to protect myself legally and financially. Instead, I dismissed their comments as hypothetical planning that would never actually affect me. After all, they were both healthy and likely to live for many more years. There would be plenty of time to discuss inheritance issues when the situation became more immediate and concrete. Now, standing in this rain with eviction papers in my hand, I realize how naive I was about my parents' true feelings and priorities. 5 years of sacrifice, hundreds of thousands of dollars in medical expenses, and countless personal opportunities abandoned all to save people who saw my dedication as proof that I didn't need their consideration or gratitude. The water running down my face tastes like salt and regret. But underneath those familiar emotions, something else is building. For the first time in years, I'm not thinking about how to fix this problem or make peace with my family's decision. I'm thinking about how wrong they are about Madison's recovery and how much they're going to regret choosing her over me. 6 months ago, everything changed with a single phone call that should have been impossible. Madison was calling from Phoenix, her voice clear and confident in a way I hadn't heard since we were children. She was clean, she announced genuinely clean this time. 3 months of intensive residential treatment had transformed her perspective on life, addiction, and family relationships. Mom cried during that conversation, tears of relief and joy streaming down her face as Madison described her newfound spiritual awakening and commitment to sobriety. Dad took the phone and spoke with his daughter for over an hour, asking detailed questions about her treatment program and recovery plan. For the first time in years, Madison sounded like the intelligent, articulate person I remembered from our childhood. 2 weeks later, she arrived in Toledo with a surprise companion. Derek appeared to be everything our parents had hoped Madison would find in a partner. Tall, muscular, with intricate tattoos covering both arms, and a face that had clearly seen its share of hard living. He spoke respectfully to Mom, and Dad called them Sir and Ma'am, and demonstrated genuine interest in their health and well-being. Madison glowed when she talked about Derek's influence on her recovery. He was 2 years clean from heroin addiction, working as a construction supervisor, and committed to building a life based on honesty and accountability. They'd met during her treatment program when he was visiting his own sponsor, and their relationship had become the foundation for her sustained sobriety. Within days of their arrival, Derek had charmed my parents completely. He fixed a squeaky door hinge that had been bothering Dad for months, helped Mom reorganize her medication schedule, and spent hours listening to stories about their medical struggles with patience and empathy. When Dad mentioned the ongoing financial stress from medical bills, Derek offered to contribute toward household expenses once he found local construction work. I watched this transformation with growing unease. Madison had never maintained sobriety for more than a few weeks, and her previous boyfriends had all been disasters that ended in drama, stolen money, or police involvement. Derek seemed too good to be true, too perfectly suited to what my parents wanted to believe about Madison's recovery. But my skepticism felt petty and mean-spirited compared to the genuine happiness radiating from Mom and Dad. They were laughing again, making plans for holiday celebrations, talking about the future, with optimism that hadn't existed during the long years of medical crises and financial struggle. Madison's presence in their home brought back memories of the daughter they'd always hoped she could become. The will restructuring announcement came during a family dinner 3 weeks after Madison's return. Dad cleared his throat formally, the way he used to when making important pronouncements during our childhood. He and Mom had been discussing their estate planning with their attorney, reconsidering how to distribute their assets in ways that would be most helpful to both their children. Since I had already established myself professionally and financially, they felt comfortable focusing their inheritance primarily on Madison's continued recovery and stability. Property ownership would provide her with security and responsibility, 2 elements her treatment counselors had identified as crucial for maintaining long-term sobriety. Madison's reaction was perfect, exactly what parents want to see when they're making sacrifices for their child's well-being. She protested initially, insisting she didn't deserve such generosity and couldn't accept something so valuable when I had contributed so much to the family's stability over recent years. Her humility and gratitude brought tears to Mom's eyes. Derek's response impressed my parents even more. He explained how property ownership had been crucial to his own recovery process, providing the sense of purpose and accountability that helped former addicts resist the temptation to return to destructive behaviors. He promised to help Madison maintain the house properly and contribute to all expenses associated with home ownership. The legal transfer happened with shocking speed. Within 2 weeks, Madison's name replaced mine on the property deed. The attorney explained that since my parents retained life estate rights, they could continue living in the house until their deaths, at which point full ownership would transfer to Madison. My years of mortgage payments, property taxes, and maintenance costs were simply absorbed into the family's history of mutual support and sacrifice. I should have protested immediately, should have demanded time to consult my own attorney, or at least understand the full legal implications of their decision. Instead, I sat in that law office feeling numb and confused, trying to process how 3 weeks of Madison's presence had undone 5 years of my financial and emotional investment in my parents' well-being. Mom interpreted my silence as mature acceptance of their choice. On the drive home, she thanked me for being so understanding about their decision to prioritize Madison's needs. Dad nodded approvingly, commenting on how proud he was to have raised a son who could put family harmony above personal gain. But something felt fundamentally wrong about the entire situation beyond just the obvious unfairness of losing the house I'd been maintaining for years. Madison's transformation seemed too complete, too convenient, too perfectly timed to coincide with our parents' estate planning discussions. Recovery from severe addiction typically involves setbacks, struggles, and gradual progress rather than sudden spiritual awakening and perfect relationship choices. My suspicions intensified when I started paying attention to small details about Madison and Derek's behavior. They were always whispering together in corners, stopping conversations abruptly when I entered rooms and receiving frequent phone calls that Derek would take outside for privacy. Madison's sobriety seemed genuine during family interactions, but I never saw her attending meetings or participating in the ongoing support activities that successful recovery typically requires. 3 weeks ago, my concerns crystallized into concrete evidence when I discovered what appeared to be vacation planning materials hidden in Madison's purse. While helping Mom carry groceries from the car, I noticed papers scattered across the kitchen table when Madison hastily grabbed her bag and hurried upstairs with Derek. One document that fluttered to the floor was an apartment lease agreement for a luxury complex in Las Vegas, Nevada. The lease term began next month with monthly rent totaling more than twice what most working-class families earn. The financial requirements for approval included proof of income or assets sufficient to cover 2 years' worth of payments up front. I photocopied that document quickly, before returning it to where Madison had dropped it. My mind racing through implications I didn't want to believe. Las Vegas represented everything Madison claimed to have rejected during her spiritual transformation. Gambling, drinking, party culture, and financial excess that would be impossible to maintain without significant assets to liquidate quickly. More disturbing evidence emerged when I started researching Derek's background through online databases accessible through my engineering firm's legal resources. His criminal history included multiple arrests for fraud, identity theft, and domestic violence across 3 different states. The most recent charges involved scamming elderly homeowners through fake construction contracts that required substantial upfront payments for work that was never completed. Derek's supposed employment as a construction supervisor turned out to be another fabrication. The company he claimed to work for had no record of his employment, and their human resources department confirmed they would never hire someone with his criminal background for supervisory responsibilities. His entire story about stable employment and financial responsibility was carefully constructed fiction. But the most damaging discovery came when I called the residential treatment facility where Madison claimed to have completed her recovery program. After explaining that I was her brother concerned about her continuing care, the intake coordinator informed me they had no record of Madison ever being a patient at their facility during the time frame she'd described. Further investigation revealed that Madison had actually spent those 3 months in county jail for identity theft charges related to stealing credit cards from elderly patients at a nursing home where she'd briefly worked. The spiritual awakening, intensive therapy, and relationship with Derek had all occurred while she was serving time for targeting vulnerable seniors with financial scams. Confronting my parents with this evidence became inevitable, but I knew they wouldn't believe me without overwhelming proof. Madison had always been skilled at manipulation, but this level of deception was sophisticated enough to fool people who desperately wanted to believe in her recovery. I needed documentation they couldn't dismiss as misunderstanding or vindictive behavior on my part. The breaking point came last Tuesday when I overheard Madison and Derek discussing their timeline for listing the house with real estate agents. They were sitting on the back porch after dinner speaking quietly, but not quietly enough to avoid my bedroom window directly overhead. Their conversation revealed a plan that was breathtakingly cynical in its manipulation of our parents' love and trust. They intended to wait exactly 30 days after completing the property transfer before contacting real estate professionals for market evaluation. Madison would claim that homeownership was triggering her anxiety and threatening her sobriety, requiring an immediate move to a smaller, less stressful living situation. The house would be listed for quick sale at a price slightly below market value to ensure rapid completion. Derek had already identified potential buyers through his criminal connections investors who specialized in purchasing properties under unusual circumstances without asking detailed questions about seller motivations. The proceeds would fund their move to Las Vegas and provide startup capital for Derek's next fraudulent business venture targeting tourists and retirees. Most sickening was their discussion of how long they could maintain the charade before Mom and Dad discovered the truth. Madison estimated they could delay any meaningful contact with our parents for at least 6 months by claiming to need space for adjustment to their new living situation. By the time our parents realized what had happened, Madison and Derek would be established in Nevada and effectively beyond legal reach. That conversation provided the final piece of evidence I needed to expose their scheme. But as I sat in my old bedroom that night staring at copies of criminal records, fake treatment documents, and Nevada apartment leases, I realized something that changed everything about my approach to this situation. I was tired of being the responsible son who protected everyone else from uncomfortable truths. For 5 years, I'd sacrificed my own opportunities and relationships to maintain family stability and harmony. My parents had repaid that dedication by choosing Madison's lies over my demonstrated loyalty, and now they were about to be victimized by their own daughter's greed and manipulation. This time, instead of trying to fix the problem quietly or convince my parents gradually, I decided to let Madison's scheme play out exactly as she'd planned. Sometimes the most powerful lessons come from experiencing the full consequences of poor decisions, and my parents needed to learn those consequences before they lost everything they'd spent their lives building together. But first, I was going to make sure Madison and Derek understood exactly who they were attempting to destroy and what kind of response they could expect when their plans inevitably fell apart. The confrontation I'd been planning happened sooner than expected, triggered by an emergency room visit that revealed how far Madison's deception had actually progressed. Last Wednesday morning, Dad collapsed in the kitchen while making coffee, his face pale and sweat beading across his forehead despite the cool autumn air. Mom called 911 immediately, then phoned me at work with panic in her voice that transported me back to his first heart attack 5 years ago. I arrived at Toledo Hospital before the ambulance pacing the emergency department waiting room while medical staff evaluated his condition and ran tests to determine what had caused his sudden collapse. Dr. Patricia Williams, the cardiologist who'd treated Dad's original heart problems, emerged from his examination room with a puzzled expression. His vital signs were stable, but his blood work showed unusual chemical imbalances that didn't match his prescribed medication regimen. Most concerning were elevated levels of substances that shouldn't have been present in his system at all. When Dr. Williams asked about changes in Dad's diet, exercise routine, or medication schedule, I mentioned that Madison had been helping Mom organize his daily pills for the past month. She'd insisted on taking over that responsibility as part of her commitment to family care and recovery-focused service to others. The doctor's expression shifted from puzzled to concerned. She requested permission to run additional blood tests, specifically designed to detect drug interactions or contamination. Something about Dad's symptoms suggested his cardiac medication might have been compromised or mixed with substances that could cause dangerous reactions in someone with his medical history. While we waited for those test results, I sat with Mom in the family consultation room and carefully explained my discoveries about Madison's real activities during her supposed rehabilitation period. I showed her copies of Derek's criminal background, the Nevada apartment lease, and documentation proving Madison had never been a patient at the treatment facility she'd claimed. Mom's initial reaction was exactly what I'd expected: disbelief, anger at my accusations against Madison's recovery, and insistence that I was jealous of my sister's transformation and looking for reasons to undermine her progress. She accused me of being unable to accept that Madison had finally gotten her life together without my help or financial support. But when Dr. Williams returned with Dad's blood test results, everything changed. The additional screening had detected traces of illegal stimulants mixed with his heart medication, creating a dangerous combination that could have caused stroke, cardiac arrest, or death. Someone had been systematically contaminating his pills with substances that amplified the effects of his prescribed medication to potentially lethal levels. The implications were impossible to ignore. Only 3 people in the house had access to Dad's medication supply: Mom, Madison, and Derek. Mom had been managing his pills for years without problems, and the contamination had only begun after Madison took over that responsibility. Someone with access to illegal drugs and knowledge of cardiac medication had been deliberately poisoning a recovering heart patient. I called the police from the hospital, requesting an investigation into elder abuse and attempted murder. The responding officers took detailed statements from Mom and me, collected Dad's remaining medication for laboratory analysis, and scheduled interviews with Madison and Derek for the following day. When we returned home that evening, Madison was waiting in the living room with Derek, both of them projecting concern and sympathy for Dad's medical emergency. Madison hugged Mom tearfully, expressing gratitude that his collapse hadn't been another massive heart attack. Derek offered to help with household chores and errands while Dad recovered from this latest health scare. Their performance was flawless, exactly the kind of supportive family response that would normally earn my parents' appreciation and trust. But knowing what I now knew about the true cause of Dad's collapse, their sympathy felt like watching sociopaths practice emotional responses they didn't actually feel. I waited until we were all gathered around the dinner table before presenting the evidence I'd collected over the previous weeks. Starting with Derek's criminal history, I methodically revealed each piece of documentation that exposed their fraud and manipulation. The apartment lease, Madison's real location during her supposed treatment, Derek's false employment claims, and finally the medical evidence of deliberate poisoning. Madison's response was brilliantly calculated to deflect suspicion and maintain her victim status. She began crying immediately, expressing shock and hurt that her own brother would fabricate such malicious accusations against her recovery and relationship. She'd worked so hard to rebuild her life and repair relationships with family members, and I was deliberately sabotaging her progress out of resentment and jealousy. Derek's reaction was more aggressive but equally manipulative. He accused me of being unable to accept Madison's independence and recovery because it threatened my role as the family's financial savior. My accusations were obviously false, desperate attempts to maintain control over my parents' resources and decision-making. If I couldn't support my sister's sobriety and happiness, perhaps I should consider whether my presence in the house was helpful or harmful to everyone's well-being. Mom and Dad listened to both presentations with increasingly confused and distressed expressions. 5 years of trusting my judgment and relying on my support conflicted with 3 weeks of believing in Madison's transformation and Derek's positive influence. The medical evidence was undeniable, but the implications were too horrible for parents to accept about their own daughter. The argument escalated quickly once Madison realized her tears and protests weren't convincing anyone. Her victim persona dissolved as she shifted to attacking my character and motivations. I was the family member who'd always resented her free spirit and independence, who couldn't tolerate anyone else receiving parental attention or support. My so-called sacrifice during their medical crisis was actually manipulation designed to control their gratitude and inheritance decisions. Derek's threats became more explicit as the evening progressed. He questioned my loyalty to family members who'd finally found happiness and stability. Perhaps I needed to consider whether my continued presence was welcome in a home where I clearly couldn't respect other people's relationships and recovery efforts. His body language shifted from sympathetic concern to barely contained violence as I continued presenting evidence they couldn't refute. Dad attempted to mediate by suggesting we all needed time to process these serious accusations before making any decisions about family relationships or living arrangements. But Mom had reached her emotional breaking point, caught between loyalty to two children with completely contradictory stories about events that would determine their family's future. The confrontation ended with Dad ordering me to leave the house immediately and not return until I was prepared to apologize to Madison for my accusations and support her recovery without reservation. Unless I could accept Derek as a positive influence on my sister's life and stop undermining their relationship with false criminal allegations, I was no longer welcome in their home. I packed my essential belongings that night while Madison and Derek watched from the living room, their expressions triumphant, but carefully controlled to appear saddened by the family conflict. As I loaded my car with clothes and work equipment, Derek approached me in the driveway with what he probably intended as a final intimidation. His message was simple and direct. I had 24 hours to retract my accusations publicly and apologize to Madison for attempting to sabotage her recovery. If I continued pursuing legal action or trying to turn our parents against their relationship, he would make sure I regretted interfering in situations that didn't concern me. His criminal history included violence against people who couldn't mind their own business. But as I drove away from that house, for what I thought might be the last time, I wasn't thinking about Derek's threats or my parents' rejection of evidence they couldn't emotionally handle. I was thinking about how much satisfaction I would feel when their carefully constructed lies inevitably collapsed under the weight of reality. 2 days later, Dad suffered another collapse, this one more severe than the first. This time, Dr. Williams was prepared for what she would find in his blood work, and the police were ready to arrest the people who'd been systematically poisoning a cardiac patient while posing as loving caregivers. Sometimes justice requires patience, and sometimes the truth reveals itself through consequences that no amount of manipulation can prevent or explain away. After Dad's second collapse landed him in intensive care, I knew waiting for justice wasn't enough anymore. The medical evidence was clear, but Madison and Derek's manipulation had been too sophisticated for my parents to accept, without overwhelming proof that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. I needed documentation that would expose every aspect of their deception. My first call was to Jake Morrison, a college roommate who'd become a private investigator specializing in fraud and elder abuse cases. Jake's background in criminal justice and access to databases beyond what I could research independently made him the perfect ally for uncovering the truth about Madison's supposed rehabilitation and Derek's criminal enterprise. Jake's initial findings exceeded even my worst suspicions about their activities. Madison's 3-month absence from Toledo hadn't been spent in luxury rehabilitation or county jail. She'd actually been serving time in Arizona State Prison for identity theft charges related to a sophisticated scam targeting elderly residents at assisted living facilities throughout Phoenix and surrounding communities. The details of Madison's crimes were sickening in their calculated cruelty. Working as the activities coordinator at various senior care facilities, she'd gained access to residents' personal information, social security numbers, and financial account details. Over 8 months, she'd systematically stolen identities from dozens of elderly victims, opening credit cards and bank accounts that she used to fund her drug addiction and gambling habits. Her arrest had come after family members noticed unusual financial activity on their relatives' accounts and contacted facility administrators. Security footage showed Madison photographing residents' personal documents during what appeared to be routine assistance with correspondence and bill paying. When police searched her apartment, they found over 200 stolen credit cards and identification documents belonging to people aged 70 to 94. Derek's involvement in Madison's criminal activities went far beyond his own history of fraud and violence. Jake discovered that Derek had been running a multi-state identity theft operation, using manipulated girlfriends to gain access to families and elderly communities where traditional security measures wouldn't detect his presence. Madison was the third woman he'd recruited for this specific type of scam. The pattern was always identical. Derek would meet vulnerable women in jail or during addiction treatment, establish romantic relationships built on promises of shared criminal profits, then deploy them as inside sources for accessing target populations. Previous girlfriends had infiltrated nursing homes, retirement communities, and private residences where they could collect personal information for Derek's broader financial fraud network. Most disturbing was Jake's discovery that Derek had researched our family extensively before Madison's release from prison. He knew about Dad's heart condition, Mom's cancer history, my years of financial support, and the property assets that would become available through inheritance or estate planning. Madison hadn't randomly chosen to target our family. Derek had specifically identified us as ideal victims for his most ambitious scam yet. The timeline Jake reconstructed revealed how carefully they'd planned their manipulation campaign. Derek had coached Madison for weeks on creating her recovery narrative, researching legitimate treatment facilities, and developing the spiritual transformation story that would appeal most effectively to desperate parents hoping for their daughter's genuine sobriety. Their preparation included studying addiction recovery literature, memorizing 12-step program terminology, and practicing emotional responses that would convince family members of Madison's authentic change. Derek had even arranged for fake references from supposed treatment counselors and sponsors who were actually accomplices in his criminal network. While Jake focused on criminal background research, I contacted Dr. Williams about getting more detailed analysis of Dad's contaminated medication. The hospital's laboratory had identified the specific substances mixed with his heart pills, but I needed to understand how someone would know to use those particular drugs to create dangerous reactions without causing immediate, obvious symptoms. Dr. Williams connected me with Detective Sarah Chen from Toledo Police Department's Elder Abuse Unit, who was already investigating Dad's case as attempted murder rather than simple medication tampering. Detective Chen's experience with similar cases had taught her to look for patterns that indicated sophisticated knowledge of pharmacology and cardiac care. The substances found in Dad's medication weren't random street drugs mixed carelessly with prescription pills. Someone with detailed understanding of cardiac medication had carefully calculated dosages designed to create cumulative damage over weeks or months while maintaining plausible deniability about the cause of his deteriorating health. This level of pharmaceutical knowledge suggested either medical training or previous experience with similar poisoning cases. Detective Chen's investigation revealed that Derek had been researching cardiac medication interactions online for months before Madison's release from prison. His search history included detailed queries about heart attack symptoms, medication overdose effects, and how to disguise poisoning as natural medical deterioration in elderly patients. He'd been planning Dad's murder from the beginning of their relationship. The motive became clear when Detective Chen obtained warrants for Madison and Derek's financial records and communication history. Text messages between them discussed timeline for property inheritance methods for convincing elderly victims to update wills, and estate planning documents and strategies for maintaining access to family assets after initial theft operations were completed. Their plan had been breathtakingly cynical in its scope. Phase 1 involved establishing credibility through Madison's fake recovery and Derek's manufactured positive influence on family relationships. Phase 2 required gradually poisoning Dad to create medical emergencies that would accelerate inheritance decisions, while appearing to result from his existing cardiac conditions. Phase 3 would have involved isolating Mom from other family members and support systems while slowly draining her financial assets through fake emergencies, fraudulent medical expenses, and manipulation of her emotional vulnerability. Derek's previous victims had been systematically robbed of their life savings through identical techniques over periods ranging from 6 months to 2 years. The final phase was designed to eliminate witnesses and escape legal consequences. Once they'd extracted maximum financial benefit from my parents, Madison and Derek planned to relocate using new identities already prepared through Derek's criminal network. Mom and Dad would be left financially destroyed, medically compromised, and emotionally devastated by their daughter's ultimate betrayal. But the most shocking discovery came when Jake traced Derek's criminal associates and previous operations. The luxury apartment lease in Las Vegas wasn't their final destination. Derek had been planning to murder Madison once they'd completed their theft from my family, keeping all profits from their crimes and eliminating the only witness who could connect him to the poisoning and fraud. Text messages between Derek and his criminal accomplices discussed Madison's usefulness as a temporary partner and her eventual disposal once she'd served her purpose in accessing my family's assets. Derek's previous girlfriends had all disappeared under suspicious circumstances after completing their assigned roles in his financial crimes. Armed with this comprehensive evidence package, Detective Chen prepared arrest warrants for charges including attempted murder, elder abuse, identity theft, fraud, conspiracy, and criminal enterprise operations. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable, but I wanted my parents to understand the full scope of their daughter's betrayal before law enforcement intervention made denial impossible. I arranged a meeting at the hospital while Dad was recovering from his latest cardiac episode, bringing copies of all criminal records, financial documentation, communication evidence, and medical reports that proved every aspect of Madison and Derek's deception. Mom and Dad needed to see the truth about their daughter's real character and the danger they'd been living with for months. But before that confrontation could happen, Derek made a critical mistake that accelerated the entire timeline and exposed their criminal enterprise in ways that even his careful planning couldn't anticipate or control. The mistake that brought down Derek's entire operation happened on a quiet Thursday afternoon when greed overcame his usual careful planning. While Madison distracted Mom with grocery shopping and errands, Derek decided to accelerate their timeline by accessing Dad's banking information for immediate financial theft, rather than waiting for inheritance procedures. What Derek didn't realize was that I'd been monitoring my parents' financial accounts since Dad's first hospitalization, watching for exactly the kind of unauthorized activity that would confirm my suspicions about their real intentions. Banking alerts sent to my phone showed attempted login attempts and password reset requests for accounts Derek shouldn't have known existed. I called Detective Chen, immediately explaining that Derek was actively attempting to access my parents' financial assets while they were away from the house. She coordinated with bank security to trace the computer being used for these illegal access attempts while dispatching officers to arrest Derek before he could complete any transactions or destroy evidence. The police arrived at the house just as Derek was downloading account statements and transferring funds between my parents' checking and savings accounts. His laptop computer contained detailed financial records for dozens of elderly victims across multiple states, along with forged documents, fake identification cards, and communication records documenting his entire criminal enterprise. Derek's arrest triggered a series of discoveries that exceeded even Detective Chen's expectations for the scope of his criminal operation. Hidden in the basement were bags containing stolen mail from throughout the neighborhood, credit cards belonging to dozens of local residents, and falsified documents for creating new identities. Derek had been running multiple fraud schemes simultaneously while living in my parents' house. The most damning evidence was Derek's detailed journal documenting his manipulation tactics and victim assessment procedures. Pages of notes described my family's vulnerabilities, optimal strategies for maintaining Madison's fake recovery persona, and timeline estimates for extracting maximum financial benefit before eliminating witnesses and disappearing. His entries about Dad's medical condition were particularly chilling. Derek had researched cardiac medication extensively, consulted with criminal associates who had medical knowledge, and calculated exact dosages needed to create cumulative damage while maintaining plausible deniability. Dad's murder was planned meticulously as the foundation for accessing inheritance assets quickly. But Derek's journal also revealed his plans for Madison once their operation was completed. Detailed descriptions of how to dispose of accomplices, previous girlfriends who had disappeared after serving their purpose, and specific methods for eliminating witnesses made it clear that Madison would have been Derek's final victim in this particular crime spree. When Madison returned from her shopping trip with Mom, she found police cars surrounding the house and Derek being loaded into the back of a patrol vehicle. Her immediate reaction was to maintain her recovery persona, expressing shock and confusion about why her boyfriend would be arrested for crimes she knew nothing about. Detective Chen allowed Madison to continue her performance for several minutes while recording everything for evidence purposes. Madison's claims of innocence and ignorance became increasingly desperate as Detective Chen presented evidence of her extensive involvement in planning and executing their criminal enterprise. The breaking point came when Detective Chen showed Madison copies of her text messages discussing Dad's poisoning timeline for inheritance theft and Derek's plans for her eventual murder. Faced with overwhelming evidence of Derek's intention to kill her after completing their operation, Madison's loyalty to their partnership evaporated instantly. Derek's betrayal of his criminal accomplice became the leverage Detective Chen needed for extracting a complete confession. Madison's desperate attempt to save herself from Derek's planned murder led to detailed admissions about their entire operation, including crimes committed against previous victims and ongoing fraud schemes targeting other families throughout Ohio and surrounding states. Madison's confession revealed the sophisticated nature of Derek's criminal network involving dozens of accomplices specializing in different aspects of elder fraud, identity theft, and financial manipulation. Her cooperation with law enforcement led to arrests across multiple states and recovery of assets stolen from hundreds of elderly victims over several years. But the most important revelation was Madison's admission that her entire recovery had been fabricated from the beginning. She'd never attempted actual sobriety, never participated in genuine treatment, and never experienced any spiritual or emotional transformation. Everything my parents believed about her change was calculated deception designed to access our family's assets. The poisoning of Dad's medication had been Madison's idea, not Derek's. Her knowledge of his cardiac condition and prescribed medications made her the perfect person to calculate dangerous combinations that would accelerate inheritance procedures while appearing to result from natural medical deterioration. She'd been actively trying to murder our father for financial gain. When Mom and Dad were finally presented with Madison's complete confession, along with physical evidence of her crimes and documentation of Derek's murder plans, their emotional reaction was devastating to witness. Years of hope for their daughter's recovery, months of believing in her transformation, and weeks of defending her against my accusations collapsed into the reality of deliberate betrayal and attempted murder. Dad's response was immediate and decisive. Despite his weakened condition from months of poisoning, he insisted on meeting with family attorneys to remove Madison from all estate planning documents and pursue every possible legal remedy for recovering financial losses. Her inheritance was permanently revoked along with any future claim to family assets or support. Mom's reaction was more complex, involving grief for the daughter she'd thought Madison had become mixed with rage at the manipulation and endangerment they'd experienced. The realization that Madison had been systematically poisoning Harold while accepting their gratitude and trust created emotional trauma that would require professional counseling to resolve. But both my parents also experienced profound regret about their treatment of me throughout this entire ordeal. Faced with evidence of my accurate assessment of Madison and Derek's real character, they recognized how completely they'd been manipulated into rejecting the son who'd been trying to protect them from their daughter's criminal enterprise. The property transfer that had stripped away my investment in the family home was immediately reversed through legal procedures designed to remedy fraud-induced transactions. Madison's brief ownership of the house was voided, and my name was restored to the property deed along with compensation for legal expenses and financial losses. Derek's arrest? Basit led to federal charges when investigators discovered the multi-state nature of his criminal operations and the number of elderly victims who'd been targeted through his network. His previous girlfriend's disappearances were reclassified as murder investigations, and additional charges were filed for crimes dating back over 5 years. Madison faced state charges for attempted murder, elder abuse fraud, and conspiracy, along with federal charges related to Derek's criminal enterprise. Her cooperation with law enforcement reduced some potential sentences, but she was looking at significant prison time for crimes that had targeted multiple vulnerable victims across several years. The house that had been at the center of our family conflict was no longer the primary issue. Derek's criminal operation had demonstrated how completely my parents had been manipulated and endangered by their own daughter's greed and Derek's sophisticated fraud schemes. Property ownership seemed insignificant compared to the reality that Madison had been planning to murder both her parents for financial gain. As Derek was led away in handcuffs and Madison was processed for federal detention, I realized that justice had been served more completely than I'd ever imagined possible. But the real satisfaction came from knowing that my parents finally understood the difference between the son who'd sacrificed to protect them and the daughter who'd been willing to kill them for money. 6 months later, I'm standing in the same spot where this story began, but everything has changed in ways that seemed impossible during those dark weeks when my family chose Madison over me. The rain has stopped, the eviction papers are long gone, and the house behind me represents something entirely different than it did that terrible evening when my belongings were scattered across the driveway. Derek's trial concluded 3 weeks ago with convictions on 14 federal charges, including murder, elder abuse fraud, and criminal enterprise operations. The judge sentenced him to 25 years in federal prison without possibility of parole, ensuring he'll never again target vulnerable families like ours. His criminal network was completely dismantled, leading to arrests in 8 states and recovery of millions of dollars stolen from elderly victims. Madison received a 4-year sentence after cooperating with federal prosecutors and providing testimony that helped convict Derek's other accomplices. Her confession revealed details about dozens of crimes that might never have been solved without her insider knowledge of Derek's operations. She'll spend her time in a federal facility designed for inmates, requiring protective custody, since Derek's criminal associates consider her betrayal of their network a death sentence warrant. The most surprising development was Madison's genuine transformation during her pre-trial detention. Faced with the reality of Derek's planned murder and the destruction her choices had caused our family, she experienced what appeared to be authentic remorse and commitment to change. Her letters from jail demonstrate clarity about her addiction, criminal behavior, and manipulation that seems fundamentally different from her previous false recovery narratives. Mom and Dad have spent months in family therapy working through decades of enabling behavior and misplaced priorities that allowed Madison's manipulation to succeed so completely. Their counselor helped them understand how their differential treatment of their children had created exactly the conditions Derek exploited to nearly destroy our entire family. The financial recovery has been more successful than anyone anticipated. Derek's criminal assets were seized and distributed among his victims, providing my parents with compensation for medical expenses and emotional trauma. Additional restitution came from Derek's accomplices, who accepted plea bargains rather than face trial for their roles in the criminal enterprise. But the most meaningful change has been in my relationship with Mom and Dad. Their experience of nearly losing Harold to deliberate poisoning while rejecting the son who was trying to protect them created a fundamental shift in their understanding of family loyalty and sacrifice. They now recognize how completely they had taken my dedication for granted while enabling Madison's destructive behavior. Dad's health has improved dramatically since the poisoning stopped, though he'll require ongoing cardiac monitoring for the rest of his life. Mom's emotional recovery has been more challenging, involving grief counseling to process the loss of the daughter she thought Madison had become, and guilt about endangering her husband's life through willful blindness to obvious warning signs. The house itself has been transformed from a symbol of unfairness into a genuine family asset managed cooperatively. My parents chose to remain in the home, where they're comfortable and close to medical care, while I maintain ownership and responsibility for major expenses. This arrangement provides them with security while acknowledging my investment and sacrifice over the years. My professional life has expanded in unexpected directions as well. The experience of investigating Derek's criminal enterprise and working with law enforcement led to consulting opportunities with firms specializing in elder fraud prevention and family financial security. I've discovered a passion for helping other families avoid the manipulation and abuse that nearly destroyed ours. Most surprisingly, my relationship with Sarah has been rekindled after she reached out following news reports about Derek's arrest and Madison's confession. Her understanding of the family crisis I'd been managing, combined with her own growth and perspective gained during our time apart, created a foundation for rebuilding our connection based on shared values and mutual respect. Sarah's parents, who had demanded I choose between family obligations and our relationship, offered sincere apologies once they understood the true nature of the emergency I'd been handling. Her father, Marcus, admitted that his ultimatum had been based on incomplete information and prejudice against my family's medical and financial struggles, rather than accurate assessment of my character and priorities. We're taking our renewed relationship slowly building trust and communication that acknowledges how much we've both learned during our separation. Sarah's experience as a pediatric nurse has given her insight into family dynamics and crisis management that makes her a valuable partner in processing the trauma and recovery our family has experienced. The nonprofit organization I established to help families dealing with addiction-related financial abuse has received funding from federal agencies interested in expanding prevention and victim support services. My personal experience with Madison's manipulation, combined with professional expertise in investigation and documentation, provides unique qualifications for helping other families recognize and respond to similar threats. During our first community presentation last month, I met dozens of people whose experiences paralleled ours in disturbing ways. Adult children systematically draining elderly parents' assets, fake recovery narratives used to maintain access to family resources, and criminal associates posing as positive influences while planning elaborate theft operations. The scope of elder abuse hidden within family relationships was far more extensive than I'd ever imagined. But the most meaningful aspect of this entire experience has been learning about the difference between enabling and supporting, between family loyalty and family accountability. My parents' willingness to examine their own behavior and make genuine changes in how they approach relationships with both their children demonstrates that people can grow and learn even after years of destructive patterns. Madison's letters from federal detention suggest she may finally be experiencing the authentic transformation she'd previously faked so convincingly. Her descriptions of addiction recovery programs, therapy sessions, and educational opportunities indicate genuine engagement with change, rather than manipulation for external benefit. Whether this transformation will prove lasting remains to be seen, but her acknowledgement of responsibility for her choices represents genuine progress. The deeper lesson from our family's crisis involves recognizing that love without boundaries becomes enabling and support without accountability becomes victimization. My parents' unconditional acceptance of Madison's behavior, combined with their expectation that I would endlessly sacrifice for family harmony, created exactly the conditions that allowed Derek's criminal enterprise to succeed. True family loyalty requires protecting loved ones from their own destructive choices, even when that protection feels like rejection or abandonment. Sometimes the most loving response to addiction and manipulation is refusing to enable continued harmful behavior, regardless of the emotional cost to family relationships. Standing here in front of the house that represents so much struggle and transformation, I'm grateful for the painful lessons that taught our family about genuine love, authentic recovery, and the difference between supporting someone's growth and enabling their destruction. Justice wasn't just Derek's conviction or Madison's sentence. Justice was our family learning to value honesty, accountability, and mutual respect over harmony maintained through denial and enabling. The rain that soaked through my shoes 6 months ago seemed like the end of everything I'd worked for and believed about family relationships. Today's sunshine represents new growth built on truth, rather than manipulation support, rather than enabling and love that requires accountability, rather than unconditional acceptance of harmful behavior. My parents chose Madison over me because they believed love meant protecting her from consequences and providing endless second chances regardless of her choices. They learned that real love sometimes requires difficult decisions that feel like betrayal, but actually represent the only path toward authentic healing and change. Have you ever faced a situation where supporting someone you loved required making choices that felt like abandonment? Have you struggled with knowing when to help and when to step back? I'd love to hear your thoughts about the difference between enabling and supporting in the comments below. If this story resonated with your own family experiences, please hit the like button and subscribe for more real stories about navigating complex family relationships. Share this video with anyone who might benefit from understanding how manipulation can disguise itself as recovery, and how sometimes the most loving choice is the most difficult one to make. Thank you for joining me through this difficult but ultimately hopeful journey about family accountability and the power of truth to heal even the deepest betrayals. Until next time, remember that genuine love requires courage to do what's right rather than what feels comfortable, and that protecting your family sometimes means protecting them from themselves.